This is an RNZ podcast.
They say it takes a village to raise a child. I'm Kathryn Ryan, and here we draw on my conversations with experts on 9 to Noon to help you navigate family life. Well, to the thorny issue of homework and how parents can find the delicate balance between helping and overhelping, or even doing it for their students. Our guest is Monash University education lecturer Melissa Barnes, who's analysed more than 400 research studies and found that parent involvement both at home and at school can help children, but they should be cautious on how to approach that help. Melissa, welcome. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Massive lot of research that you've done that's really interesting. Do you want to synthesise as best you can some of the main things you've taken from it?
Yes, well, first of all, the analysis is basically of other articles, and I think what's interesting is what we know about research, the research we know about homework, is that there is this connection between parent involvement and student achievement, and part of that is kind of how parents help, and that's both inside at home, but also their involvement at school. However, I think the interesting kind of link across all of the studies is that it's the overhelping with homework that actually has kind of a detrimental effect on student outcomes. And I think that's partly because when we overhelp, our children don't actually learn and they don't know how to do it on their own. So when they actually have to show that they understand things, they become so dependent on others' help. So it's really important as parents to kind of understand how do we actually prepare our children to be able to kind of understand tasks, how do we help them, but not overhelp so they become too dependent on us. Not
end up doing the homework is another one.
Yes.
What is happening? Because many schools are moving away from the idea of set homework full stop, and another age-old debate. So is there an enormous variation that parents may come across and students may come across with what it actually is in the first place?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important to think about what is the purpose of homework. And I think, and I understand actually parents should be really thinking about and talking with teachers about what the purpose of homework is. Now, I think homework can be very helpful in the sense of really helping students consolidate their understanding of things, practicing and revising. I think that's really important. But I think the thing is that sometimes homework is given, and particularly without a very, a purpose, and it can cause a lot of frustration from particularly young children, but actually older as well. And I think it's knowing that it's about learning, not trying to provide homework just as another thing to do. So understanding what is the purpose of homework, and ensuring that it's not too much, but really letting it be, helpful in consolidating students' learning instead of actually being a barrier.
Well, let's get to how parents should be involved. I think the research also found that most kids don't like homework.
Yeah, well, I think across the board, a lot of research says, and this is interesting because I think as parents, we actually don't really like homework. I have 2 young children. And I remember particularly when we had readers, when they're reading, and every day, having to open those up and listen to them kind of struggle through the reading. And it's a lot of time, and it was me trying to be very patient. And I think what's interesting is that generally, I think that students don't like homework. They don't necessarily see the value. And I think that's a really important thing is understanding what is the purpose of this? How am I actually learning through this process? But I think as parents, our kind of approach and our modeling of what we think of homework is really important. If we find it such a chore and if we find it really annoying, I think that goes back to, our children, and I think that they see that. So, sometimes we recommend for parents that, instead of making it a punishment, like you have to go in your room and you have to do your homework, of kind of going, well, here's a time for us to learn. So maybe I'm reading a book instead of watching TV. So it's not like it's a punishment, but it's an opportunity and a space for the family to kind of go, okay, we think learning is important and we will do this together.
That's an important word you use because one of the points that you make is it is an opportunity to learn, not to perform and come out with some perfect result, but to learn. And it's tricky, isn't it? Because by the very nature of homework, often people are asked to produce something, right? And how do you approach then, say, I don't know, let's go sort of primary school age. They've got to write up, or maybe do a poster or come up with some kind of visual project. How do you talk about what the purpose of that is?
Well, and I think it's really important to understand that we are actually preparing our children for, general life tasks. And so I think, one of the things that in our paper we discuss kind of having a homework plan. And I think one of the things that parents can do is helping and talking with our children about, well, what is the task? And getting them to try to reiterate, to discuss what the purpose of it is. Then breaking it up into very manageable tasks, and then being able to kind of allocate time for each task, and then create a timeline to work backwards and tick those things off. And I think that's just general life skills of being, okay, I have to do something. What is required? How will I do this? And then how will I know that I've achieved it? And I think that's an important thing that as parents we can help encourage. And I think, it's really interesting, particularly in light of all of the COVID-19. And here in Australia in particular, we, obviously there was a lot of home learning. And I had so many of my friends say, oh, I just got so tired. And I just said, move over, I'm going to finish this and send this off. And I find that parents, as we do, we really want to complete the task. We have this real focus on completing the task instead of going, actually, how do we learn through the process of this? So we're really focusing on the learning rather than the completion. And I think that's preparing our children for the skills that they need to be successful in life, and not just being able to tick a box and saying we've completed it.
So you are helping them also break down the task and work through the tasks of completing the project itself, rather than specifically helping them answer or do what the tasks are. That's kind of a fine line though, isn't it? Because if they are stuck, that old word, if they're stuck on something, how do you sit alongside them then? I mean, obviously you're trying to nurture them towards being able to go through the process themselves, but when they are stuck, what's the conversation you have?
Well, I think it comes down to asking a lot of questions, and there will be times that they do need some extra help, and we need to help them with that. But I think it's involving them in the process, and I think that's where the discernible line is, because a lot of times I think it's very easy to just say, okay, here's how you do it, just do it this way, instead of going, okay, have a look at this, what do you think about this, and then getting them to model it and get them to do it. And I think that takes time, and it takes a lot of patience. And I think that's the hard thing, is that as parents, we're busy. I'm a working parent, and ultimately I want to get things done. And I think it's good even for me to think about, well, what is the purpose of this? It is really about learning. So how do I step back? How do I actually help my children do the task, but not so much that they become so dependent on me doing it for them that they're actually learning through the process.
You suggest that you sit down and model how you might do a task, then perhaps complete the next one together, and then the child does it on their own, and hopefully you can back out. It's a case of coming in at certain points and then backing out. It does require commitment, and you made the point, maybe you can try and coordinate, particularly with younger children, where you might have some time. You might be reading a book or trying to do some recreation time coinciding with their schoolwork, where you can actually commit to dipping in and out as needed. It's a big ask, but can that be effective?
Yeah, and I think, it's really interesting, I think, too, another point to make is that we don't do this kind of, by our own. And I think that, having conversations with our the schools that our children are in, and ensuring, what are the tasks, what is our role, and really understanding and working with our children. I think these conversations are really important. And it's also knowing what you can and can't do. Another really interesting thing is that I think as parents, we also kind of have certain things that we think that we can help with and other things that we can't. For example, we might say maths is my thing, but English is not. And I think it's really important to understand that it's not about us being experts in a field, but it's being able to kind of help ask those questions, get our students, and helping them see what resources are out there to actually be able to answer their questions and to help them. So we are one resource, but I think it's also getting them to see what are the other resources, and knowing that even if we don't actually know, I kind of worry, particularly with my children when they're older and doing advanced math, so I'm thinking, will I be able to help them? But I think it's understanding what our role is and how do we actually support, but how do we also help them see the resources around them? How do we connect with the school and be able to talk with teachers and knowing how to best support them at home?
You're almost like a coach rather than a tutor, yeah? You're encouraging them their behaviour and their tenacity and giving positive feedback for perseverance rather than being the person actually telling them how to solve advanced trig or whatever. Creating a homework plan is important and this is often, I imagine, for students who are transitioning into a different level of education. There comes a point where you really need to learn the disciplines of planning a whole year actually, but certainly planning much more significant chunks of work. And what are some of the obvious things to do with a student getting into that more advanced level to help them understand how to strategically approach the overall, planning of their work?
Yeah, well, and I think that's where it's, as I mentioned before, I think it's, getting them to be able to articulate and to explain what they need to do for the particular task, what they need to know, what are those skills that they need to know, and then being able to kind of discuss how they would go about to know that information, what they need to do. So breaking it down into manageable chunks and going, okay, this is what I need to know, this is what I know, and this is how I'm going to get to the point where I actually have those skills or that understanding to be able to complete this task. But I think part of that is that planning of creating that timeline as well, and then being able to say, okay, if I break this into 4 tasks, and I need to complete this, within a week, what am I going to do each day to do that? And I think those are just really important life skills, getting them to understand how to break down very large tasks. So I think that's the one thing that's really daunting for all young people, is being able to kind of see a task that seems very unwieldy, and knowing how to break it down into something that's manageable.
Interesting, out of the research, parents, I think you alluded to this earlier, parents helping children with homework was linked to higher levels of motivation and engagement, but lower levels of academic achievement. Is that what we were talking about earlier, that if you end up taking over, okay, the kid might be happy, but it's not necessarily going to boost their ability results-wise? Yeah,
and it goes back to that idea that we want our children to learn. And, I found it really interesting because I think particularly in the later years when there's a lot of tests, and I think about my own experience, and, there was always those couple of nights before the test and you're cramming, you're trying to learn that. And look, that revision, and that's important. But if I think back, did I really know the content? Maybe not. And I think it's really trying to focus on what's the purpose. And really, as parents, encouraging the learning. We want our children to actually learn and be able to, we do want them to do well on tests, but ultimately we actually want them to learn the content. And again, it's, I think, preparing them for, their futures of going, okay, well, how do we actually make learning meaningful?
Yeah. That why, what's the point, is a perennial question, and sometimes a very fair one. And you have to have your answers, even if it's, going to be, because we want to get really skilled at being able to break down and organise a set of tasks. That's not going to turn anyone on fire, is it? But in your own mind, you're knowing that's what's the purpose is. Or it may be just to get really excited about, I don't know, a novel or something, or get excited about reading and being able to analyse what's happening when an author is writing something. You want it to be their purpose rather than yours, though, Melissa? You want them to find their purpose for doing something?
Well, I think this is it goes back to this idea that we want young people to like learning. And I think that's what's interesting, is that often homework is kind of, even when I think about it, it has a very negative connotation. And maybe that's from my own schooling experience. But we link that kind of learning with this painful process. But ultimately, we want our children to love the idea of learning, because we, as we all know, it doesn't stop after we finish, secondary school. We have to learn new skills and so on. So we really want to instill this love of learning. And I think that's being able to kind of see learning outside of the tasks that come back from homework. And, we do have this focus on homework, but I think as parents, we provide really meaningful learning opportunities outside of that. Watching a documentary, asking questions about a book they're reading, those things are quite meaningful. And I think it's making that learning meaningful for everyday life, and knowing that learning happens every second of the day, and it can be very enjoyable. It's not just only homework that comes from having to complete tasks from
It's
school.
really important, isn't it? It's not just this onerous thing that has to be done. As you say, it's losing the word homework and turning it into learning, and seizing whatever opportunity is to make it normal for learning to happen. You know, when you've got that opportunity presenting itself. I am curious, just as an aside to all this, are we seeing much of a move towards the so-called flipped classroom, where kids do more independent stuff at home, have a first go using, I don't know, either using reading or some other kind of mechanism to have a go at something, and then at school, that's where they have the questions already or the bits they don't understand and the teacher gets involved. Is it getting much traction?
Well, I think that there is, there's some great benefits of that, partly because it also allows young people to, if they need more time, really understanding the content, they have that time and then they can come with questions. So I think it is a very valuable approach. But again, it will be dependent on how teachers scaffold that understanding when they get into the classroom, and also understanding that parents have different priorities, and how do you make students accountable to ensure that they're doing that work independently, and how do we actually create independent learners to be able to effectively use that approach.
Thank you. Our guest has been Melissa Barnes, Monash University education lecturer. She has analysed more than 400 research studies to come up with her advice on how to make the most as a parent, how to make the most of helping your child with homework. And mainly it's about helping them get into the habit of it and see it as a love of learning and see the purpose for it, rather than finishing their project for them, tempting as that may be.